Hi guys, it's Jess from Honest Fiction and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I am going to be sharing my top 10 favorite fantasy romance books of 2024. Alright guys, so we have finally reached the end of 2024, and I'm gonna be honest, 2024 was not my favorite year. I had a lot of ups and downs, but when it came to reading, specifically fantasy romance, 2024 was phenomenal. I read so many 5-star fantasy romance books, and honestly, I was very nervous to put this video together because I knew it was going to be absolutely impossible to narrow it down to 10. And it kind of was. So I ended up with 13 fantasy romance books. I do have 3 honorable mentions, and then I will end with my top favorite fantasy romance book of the year. I am so excited to talk about these books with you guys. Now, if you're unfamiliar with my channel, I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. You can also hit that notification bell to be notified whenever I post new bookish content. You can also check out my Instagram, Goodreads, and Patreon, all linked down below. With all that out of the way, let's talk about these fantasy romance books. Alright guys, so starting off with honorable mentions, first up we have Peaches and Honey. Now this is the first book in an adult fantasy romance duology, and I will say this book completely blew me away. The writing was so lyrical, it was almost like poetry, and I'm not someone who really pays a lot of attention to like whimsical writing, but I just thoroughly enjoyed this book. So if you're unfamiliar with the story, it is set in 12th century England, and we are following Anna. Now, Anna has lived as an outcast due to her vitiligo, so she has endured years of suffering from the people in her village. Now, all of this changes when a selfless act leads a mysterious stranger to granting Anna a peach of immortality. So Anna, after accepting this gift, takes a bite of the peach and becomes immortal. So most of this book is following Anna as she survives through the centuries and just learns about humanity, and her only constant is the shape-shifting god that granted her the immortality. And the story really takes off from there. Now, if you noticed, this book is very similar to The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab? I always get that wrong. But I will say I actually like this just a little bit better. I feel like there was a little bit more of a romance in this book, and I also really loved following Anna as a character. She goes through so much, and this book just really showcases how sometimes being immortal, there are a lot of downsides, and it really shows you the cruelty of humanity, but also these beautiful moments. So highly recommend. I love this book. And next up for honorable mentions, we have The Last Lost Girl by Casey L. Bond. Now, this is the first book in an adult fantasy romance series. I do believe this is the only book that has released, but the second book is set to release in 2025. And I really hope the audiobook releases at the same time as the physical book, because I have been dying to read the next book in this series. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the story, it is a Peter Pan reimagining, and we are following Ava. Now, Ava was an orphan, and she ended up being found by this girl named Belle, and they have really taken care of each other, which recently has become harder and harder because Belle seems to be succumbing to some sort of madness. Now, Belle one night absolutely loses her mind and ends up flying Ava magically to this dark, mysterious realm that we later find out is Neverland. And in this Neverland, Peter Pan is actually evil, and he controls the Lost Boys with this very dark magic. So Ava, now separated from Belle, is trying to find her when she gets captured by Hook, and she has to decide if she's willing to trust Hook, even though he seems to only be out for vengeance. And it's their romance. I loved this. I loved this so much. So I ended up picking this book up on a whim at a Polycon. I was talking to the author, and she was just kind of discussing what this book was about, and I'm so happy I gave this book a try. So highly recommend, if you have not read this, giving this a shot. It is my favorite Peter Pan reimagining, and it really plays around with the amnesia trope. So when you're in Neverland, your memories kind of get a little messed up, and you're not exactly sure what's real and what's not. So pretty much every character in this is an unreliable narrator, and I love that trope so much. So highly, highly recommend. And last up for honorable mentions, we have White Horse, Black Knights. Now, I actually read this back in January. It is the first book in an adult fantasy romance series. Now, the second book has released. Unfortunately, I have not read it yet, but as soon as I do a reread of this, I will be picking it up because I loved this first book. So in the story, we are following Sabine, and in this world, there are people known as marked ones, and they are marked, and this designates them as having a certain godly gift. So Sabine is able to communicate with animals, which is the coolest power. Now, Sabine has been locked away in a convent for the last 12 years, and she ends up being chosen to become the bride of this ruthless High Lord. So she's essentially exchanging one prison for another. Now, her new husband has requested that Sabine travel completely nude for, I believe, 20 days to his kingdom so he can show off his new bride to all of his people. And the only person that will be traveling with Sabine is the guard of his choosing. So the story really goes from there, and it is kind of like a traveling romance. I loved the magic in this. It also has like a dark kind of gritty tone, and overall, this was just such a fun read. All right, guys, so we have made it to the top 10. Now, while these books are in a ranking order, I will say the first 5 I'm going to talk about are pretty interchangeable. I think I rated them all 4.5 or 5 stars. So personally, they are all amazing reads, and I know when I am editing this back, I am probably going to want to change up the order, but just know that. But anyway, the first book we have is Blood and Steel, and this is the first book in the Legend of Thezmarr series. Now, I am currently hosting a read-along along with my patrons, and we are reading the series and having a fabulous time. So if you're unfamiliar with the story, we are following Althea, and Althea lives in a world where women are no longer allowed to wield weapons. But this has not stopped Althea. Her biggest dream is to become a warrior of legend. Now, on top of her sneaking around and training, Althea is working against a clock because she knows she is going to pass away at some point when she turns 27. So Althea trains so hard and is able to sneak around and eventually overcomes all of these odds and is able to fight or battle her way through this initiation in order to become a warrior of legend. Now, she is assigned a mentor who is this very grumpy individual who is also an amazing fighter, and it is their romance. It is so unbelievably good. I will say the friendships is really where this book shines. The world building is amazing, and all of the characters are so fleshed out. You will definitely have your favorites. I know I do. And also the humor in this is very, very well done. So I've seen this book compared to The Witcher, and it definitely has Witcher vibes, but also some of the training sequences and like this schoolish setting reminded me a little of Fourth Wing. So if you're a fan of either of those, I would definitely check this series out. And next up is one of the only standalones on this list. We have A Ship of Bones and Teeth by Karina Halle. This is a dark Little Mermaid reimagining, and I had been waiting years to read this book. My friend actually purchased me the special edition, I think 2 Christmases ago, and I never got around to it. But the audiobook finally dropped in 2024, and I can confidently say it was 100% worth the wait. This book was so good. It checks all my boxes when it comes to dark fantasy romance. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the story, it follows the classic tale pretty much in the beginning. We are following Princess Marin, who ends up selling her soul in exchange for legs to a evil sea witch. Now, we jump in time, and Marin is now trapped in a loveless and abusive marriage to Prince Eric, and they are sailing the seas together. And really, Marin is just longing for freedom and to return to the sea. Now, an opportunity presents itself when the ship Marin and her husband are traveling on is taken over by the dread Captain Batista, who also harbors a lot of animosity towards that same sea witch. So they decide to team up to try to get vengeance, and it's their romance. This story deals with the captor-captive trope. It also has a lot of like who hurt you moments that I absolutely ate up. There's also a pet shark that is so adorable, and a lot of other just really dangerous and maniacal sea monsters, and it's just filled with action, and once again, super dark. There's also a curse placed on the crew. I'm not exactly going to go into what it is, but it added an extra element of just suspense, and overall, this book is perfection. So please pick this up if you haven't yet. And next up is Nectar of the Wicked by Ella Fields. This is the first book in a dark fantasy romance duology. Now, I have talked about this book a lot since I have finished it, and I feel like I haven't properly prepared people for the amount of dark events that happen towards the end of this book and also in the sequel. So just know going in, this is pretty dark, but overall, this is my favorite duet by Ella Field, and I think I've rated every single one of her books 5 stars. So that is saying something. She is one of my favorite authors. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the story, we are following a changeling fae that has been raised in the Middle Lands, and she has no idea where she came from, who her parents are, or even what her name is. So she has been raised by an abusive guardian who ends up passing away at the very start of this book. Now our main character is left with no idea where she comes from or what she should do, and she is just desperate for answers. And that is when a wicked fae king makes an appearance and says, hey, if you agree to marry me, I will take you to the Fae lands and I will help you find the answers you are searching for. And the story goes from there, and I loved this so much. So in this story particularly, the morally gray love interest, he's almost a villain. He is so evil, and he does a lot of pretty terrible things, but I loved their romance and just like the build up. Also, this deals with like trickster fae, so you really have to figure out the double meaning in everything they're saying, and the spice was perfection. So highly recommend, one of my favorite duologies of all time. And next up, we have Glow of the Everflame, which is the second book in the Kindred Curse Saga series by Penn. Now, I obviously can't get into what this book is about because it'll give away all of the spoilers. Just know this is my favorite in the series. However, if you're unfamiliar with Spark of the Everflame, we are following Diem Bellator, and she is living in this very impoverished village that is ruled over by the Descended being descended from gods. So they are very powerful, and some of them are very cruel. So one day, Diem's mother ends up vanishing, and Diem now is thrust into the world of the Descended royalty. And she has to decide where her loyalties lie. Will she join a mortal rebellion that is trying to take down the Descended, or will she team up with the heir of the Descended in the hopes of finding answers to what happened to her mother? And overall, this was such an unexpected, 5-star series. I'd seen a few people reading this book, and honestly, the first book, I thought it was okay, but this second book, the slow burn romance in this, oh my gosh, you are going to be wanting them just to kiss already. And I love a good slow burn, and this series is probably the slowest I've read. So overall, if you like A Court of Thorns and Roses and series that are similar, I think you will love this series. I feel like this is going to come as a shock that this next book is not in my top 5. However, I have just read so many amazing fantasy romances, and it was very hard to figure out where to place this. So we have When the Moon Hatched by Sarah A. Parker. Honestly, I love this. I will say the beginning is kind of hard to navigate. I listened to the audiobook while following with the physical book, and I still had to listen to the beginning a few times before I fully was able to comprehend it. That being said, this book is beautiful and is such a journey that I do a terrible job of trying to summarize. So if you're unfamiliar with the plot of this, I'm going to give you a very basic breakdown. We are following Rave, and Rave lives in a world where dragons have fallen from the sky. So Rave is now an assassin, and she ends up being captured and thrown into a dungeon where it is assumed that she will eventually be killed. So while Rave is kind of stewing in this dungeon, we then follow Khan, who is a king that is just mourning the loss of his kingdom and the people that he has loved, and he is searching for fallen moon shards. Now, while searching for these shards, he ends up in a dungeon where he finds Rave, and together they team up and try to solve mysteries that have echoes of the past, and it goes from there. I know that synopsis did not make a lot of sense. It is so hard for me to summarize this, so I apologize. I am so afraid of giving away a spoiler. This book is written in such a way that it almost feels like a puzzle you have to solve. You are really learning everything along with these main characters, and it is such a unique way of writing. If you've read other books by this author, she kind of has a similar style with all of her books, but is one of the reasons why I love her. But that being said, I did struggle a little bit to understand the very beginning of this book, which is why it is a little lower on my rating list. And coming in at number 5, we have Quicksilver by Callie Hart. This book gained so much hype when it first released, and honestly, I think it is worth all of the hype. This story is very unique and honestly refreshing, but it still has all of those fantasy romance tropes that we adore, plus the banter in this was top tier. If you're unfamiliar with the story, we are following Cerys, and Cerys has been living as a thief trying to survive under the Undying Queen. Well, all of that almost comes to an end when she is captured and sentenced to death. Well, she ends up bleeding out in this dungeon, and then suddenly a realm opens up, and out of it comes Kingfisher, who is this deadly and very grumpy and attractive fae who promptly takes Cerys, heals her, and then brings her to his fae realm, where he informs her that she's actually an alchemist and one of the few people able to manipulate a certain compound that he believes will help save his people. But he's also unbelievably grumpy and brooding, and is very reluctant to deal with Cerys, despite the fact that they end up being magically bonded to each other. So the beginning of this definitely has an enemies to lovers type feel to it. I loved the fae, I loved the magic, and similar to Serpent and the Wings of Night, this book very much just drops you into the story and the action, and I love books that do that. So overall, my only critique with this was, why did we decide on Kingfisher as the love interest name? It's not my favorite. I am so sorry if it is your name. No hate to you. It's just every time I read it, it kind of took me out of the story a little bit. But overall, I am so excited to see where this series goes. And coming in at number 4, we have Fear the Flames by Olivia Rose Darling. Just know it was almost impossible for me to pick between Fear the Flames and Quicksilver, and depending on the day, I will probably change my mind. Honestly, when I'm editing this, I might be mad at myself. So I love both of them almost equally. But if you're unfamiliar with Fear the Flames, we are following Elwyn. And Elwyn is the princess in a kingdom, and when she was very young, she bonded with dragons. Now, her father believes, because she was able to do this, that she is actually part of a prophecy that says that one day she will destroy the entire kingdom with her dragons. So he promptly locks up Elwyn and takes her dragons from her. Well, Elwyn is able to escape, however, she has to leave her dragons behind, which is absolutely devastating. So years have passed, and Elwyn has now set up a secret kingdom, but she is still longing for her dragons and also for revenge. So she ends up teaming up with one of her father's enemies in the hopes of doing this heist in order to find her dragons and reclaim her kingdom. And the story goes from there. Now, I have seen a lot of people say that this is enemies to lovers. I disagree. I think this is more of reluctant allies to lovers, but I did really enjoy the romance in this, and it was much spicier than I was expecting. I will also say that this was originally published as indie pub and just came out this year with a traditional publisher, and I'm very curious to see what they omitted, because my biggest critique with this book is some things didn't feel completely fleshed out. There were some transitions that were very abrupt, and I felt like we could have just spent some more time investigating certain aspects of this book. It's very hard to do this without spoilers, but overall, I love this. And if you're a fan of Game of Thrones, there is a Dracarys moment at the end of this that I was kicking my feet. It was so, so good. So highly, highly recommend. And at number 3, we have Blood of Hercules by Jasmine Mass. This is a dark, wide shoes fantasy romance that I was obsessed with. And honestly, this is probably going to be the most controversial book on this list, but reading is subjective, and I had such a fun time with this book. There is a snake animal companion that is super feisty and murderous. Also, the main character in this has such a dark sense of humor, and it just worked. I also love wide shoes romance, and although there's not a lot of spice in this, I have a feeling the next book is going to be super spicy. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the plot, we are following Alexis, and Alexis is a foster child living in a world where the Titans have invaded. And the only people able of stopping the Titans are the gods, and then the Spartans, who are like, not the children of the gods, but they're descendants of the gods. So Alexis, being a foster child, has been living a horrible life, and really she is just trying to get by along with her younger foster brother. Well, eventually she comes of age and has to take a test where it's determined Alexis actually has Spartan blood. So she's whisked away to a Spartan war academy where she immediately has to battle to the death to see if she will be assigned a Spartan mentor. And the story progresses from there, and it is so, so good. I love all of the guys in this. They are so unhinged. Like, it's not morally gray. They are all villains, and they do horrible, horrendous things, but somehow all of it worked. So please, if you've been hesitant to pick this up, just know it is one of my favorite reads of the year, and so unbelievably good. And my second favorite fantasy romance book of the year is Reign of Shadows and Endings by Melissa K. Roehirch. This is the first book in the Legacy series, which is a companion series to the Lady of Darkness series, which I still have not finished. Now, if you are familiar with my channel, you are probably slightly confused because I have been saying this is my top read of the year since I finished it about 6 months ago. However, I have recently read a book that slightly beat it, but overall, I love this series. I have not felt butterflies and just sheer giddiness reading a series since I first read ACOTAR, so that should give you an idea of how much I loved this series. Now, I will also say this book is very, very dark. Actually, the series in general is very dark, and it does heavily rely on the captor-captive and forced proximity trope, so definitely check trigger warnings before starting. But if you're unfamiliar with the story, we are following Tessa, and Tessa is living in a world where the gods have granted power to their offspring, known as the Legacy, to rule over the Fae. And Tessa is a Fae. So she knows when she comes of age, she is going to be forced to work in one of the 6 Legacy houses. Well, that day comes, and Tessa is very surprised to find out that she has been bestowed the honor of becoming the primal source to the Heir of Endings. Now, Tessa does not want this responsibility because it means she will have these tattoos placed on her that allow the Heir of Endings to be able to sense her presence, read her thoughts, and she's even going to become somewhat drawn to him physically and emotionally. So it is a huge commitment that Tessa does not want any part of. So the whole book is kind of like a forced mating bond, which I thought was a very unique concept. And I will say, the love interest in this, I kind of hated throughout most of this first book. He definitely redeems himself in the second book and the third book. But in this first one, I don't think you're really supposed to like him. But overall, this just, once again, checked all of my boxes in terms of dark fantasy romance. I loved all of the characters. There's also different paranormal creatures. I'm not even going to tell you what they are, but pretty much everyone you can think of makes an appearance in this book. So please, if you have been nervous to pick this up, it is so, so good. You do not have to read Lady of Darkness first. However, I do kind of recommend you do because there are characters that do pop up from that series in this book, specifically book 2. But either way, this book was a 5-star and so, so unbelievably good. And that brings us to my top fantasy romance of 2024, which unfortunately is not actually a fantasy romance. It is a high fantasy with romantic elements, but I wanted to include it if you are someone who's familiar with my channel and you tend to like the books that I read. This is not only the best book that I've read this year, this is one of the best books I have read in my entire life. There has not been a day since I finished reading this that I haven't thought about certain scenes or characters in this book. The world building is so amazing and immersive. I still cannot believe this is a debut. Also, the magic system is some of the best I've ever read. So please, I am begging you, if you have not read this, this book is so, so beautiful. And last time I talked about it, I cried. So we're not going to do that this time. But if you're unfamiliar with the story, we are following a group of warriors that are living in the Kaigen Peninsula, which is a peninsula that separates the outside world from this empire. So they are seen as the first line of defense against invaders, and that is because certain warriors in this grouping have the ability to create a whispering blade, which is a magical blade that can cut through anything. So one of our POVs is Momoru, who is the eldest son of the village leader, and at the young age of 14, he is almost able to produce a whispering blade. Now, Mamoru really just wants to prove himself to his father and his family. He's incredibly ambitious, and I absolutely loved him as a character. Now, we're also following Misakai, who is Mamoru's mother, and she was forced into a loveless marriage, and really her chapters are about navigating this world as a mother. She had not planned on having children, and she kind of questions what her life would have been like had she not been forced into this marriage, and she's still trying to show off her power and is trying to figure out a way just to navigate being married to this powerful family and not really seeing a place for herself. And overall, the story was just so, so good. I will say, have all of your tissues ready. I have not cried so much reading I can't remember the last time I cried so much reading a book. My husband actually read this before me, and I was talking to him about the plot, and he just started sobbing. So it's not just me. This book is so beautiful and just so rich in its storytelling, and I love this. So if you can't tell, I think I've gushed about this enough. Please, I know it's not technically a fantasy romance, but you will not regret reading this. All right, guys, those were my top fantasy romance books of 2024. Please let me know down in the comments below what is the best fantasy romance book you've read this year. And I'd like to say a special thank you to my Paladin protectors, Amanda, Erin, Leslie, Lotta, Kat, and Jess. Thank you guys so much for supporting my channel. And I said this already, I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday. And if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. I will see you all next week. Bye.